Hello, 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 hello. This is Anthony Choice DSN, and this is the Left Off Center podcast. This is episode zero, or prototype episode, if you will. It's just going to be me today, and I'll give a little background. For those that don't know, the reason it's spelled center, and ironically, technically, this is the second show because the first show lasted all of 2 seconds because I misspelled center by spelling it correctly. Um, Center, Center, is a street in San Jose. It's a short street. It's not very long. It only goes a few blocks. Well, more than a few blocks, but it uh, was in and near the neighborhood that I used to live in. But only people from the San Jose area probably would know what Center Road is, and particularly if you're a low-income person. Um, has nothing to do with the neighborhoods. It has to do with where social services are available in the city. So we're left off center. Left off center because, well, a little, I would say but we're a little off. And then also left because this is kind of a radical emphasis on radical history and events and analysis and news as pertains to Silicon Valley and San Jose in particular. um, the Left of Center, the Left Off Center podcast came about in part due to a recent discussion and meeting I had with author Max Ebaum, author of Revolution in the Air, the, the, how the 60s turned to Mao, Che, and Lenin. I believe I have that name possibly right. In any event, in our discussion, we had a good conversation. I was filling you in on some South Bay history and things like that, just discussion. And then a portion of the discussion, he was telling me he was going to be, doing some junket material for his own book that just got re-released. It's third edition, I believe. I highly recommend you pick it up. Again, Revolution in the Air by Maxi Ball. And in the process of the conversation, I was reminded that people don't read, essentially, today. Like, it's just not as common as it used to be, whereas podcasts, YouTube shows, things like that are the way to go. And more importantly, publishing is a slow process. One, it's a slow process in writing, and then there's the time between then and now, then and it getting to print, and then getting it to a store into someone's hands. And then there's the fact that there's a barrier of people just getting it in their hands. A podcast, on the other hand, or a show, is immediate. Anyone can listen to me. There's no need for massive edits, rewrites, all these sorts of things. And it's available right now. Anyone that knows me knows that for the last more than a decade, I've been working on a book, Cities of Chrome, a radical people's history of Silicon Valley, as well as Silicon Babylon, which is more of a obscure, less academic and formal historians look at Silicon Valley. And it's just been slow. And the main reason it's been slow, ironically, is because I felt I needed to have not just an analysis of this place or a bunch of facts and historical stories and things like that, but I wanted to have a description or sense of what this place is. What is Silicon Valley? How is it operating today? And typically when people hear that, they're going to think, tech, obviously, technology, Facebook, Google, Apple computer, you name it. And that's a problem. And then there's a secondary problem, which is what is Silicon Valley? And in the coming weeks, in fact, very soon, there's supposed to be 2 major releases on Silicon Valley that just come out. A People's History, I believe, is due out later this month, end of this month. And then another book was just released, In the Shadow of Silicon Valley, I believe. And that's a book about Silicon Valley, San Francisco. The problem I have is the overwhelming majority of these texts, and I've read most, if not all of them, are one, focused on technology, computer technology specifically. And then now there's been a turn away from actual physical geographic Silicon Valley toward a reinterpretation of what that is as a greater Bay Area notion that somehow the greater Bay Area, because this Bay Area is Silicon Valley, and it just isn't. San Francisco is not Silicon Valley. San Francisco is an adult playground that happens to have some tech firms in it. Silicon Valley is predominantly two counties, and one is the largest county in all of San Francisco Bay Area, and that is Santa Clara County. It covers, I believe, over 200 square miles. And then the second county is the peninsula, which is San Mateo County. And that's those two areas together build the corridors of the two major freeways that run, which is 880 and 580, runs up towards the East Bay, and then 101 and 280, which runs up north to San Francisco. It's in this corridor that Silicon Valley emerged and slowly but surely sprawled. And anyone that knows this place will know, if you really want to know if you're in Silicon Valley, just ask one question. Is El Camino Real part of the city? El Camino Real is one of the oldest roads in all of California. It probably is, to be honest, it's probably built on an old Indian road. But Camino Real is the King's Road, the King's Highway. Today, the actual El Camino Real extends from all the way from like Oregon and Alaska all the way down into South America. It's the Pan American Superhighway. Most people don't know that outside of the local area. Now, having said that, the segment that is called El Camino Real, actually called that by name, runs up and down the peninsula, north to south, on the western side of the bay, the arm of the bay, if you will. And now you can basically drive on that road, and it's not though it is a freeway, it is not a freeway in the sense that it is closed off from stoplights and interchanges and crosswalks and stuff like that. No, it's a normal street. It's just a very wide street, very busy street. And in the past, you used to be able to travel it, and there were gaps in it where there was nothing, no development. In some cases, there was, just open fields, open land, stuff like that. But in the growth of the Bay Area, and specifically in the Silicon Valley area, has made this corridor now heavily populated where you can drive from city to city to city to city, never leave the street, and not ever be in a place where there's nothing. Like it's hard to differentiate one city from the next. That is Silicon Valley. That road is, the best way to describe it would be like the main vein. It's the blood, the central the central ventricle, if you will, that from which the blood of innovation and technology and imagination and money and a whole lot of other things can be drawn. And running parallel to that are those two freeways, 101, 280. So what was Silicon Valley, and how did it place in this contemporary moment? I've spent a majority of my years, I'm in my 43rd year, and I've easily spent 30 years of my life, let's say, give or take, in one way, shape, or form involved in community organizing, activism, radicalism, and historical study, and specifically of this place, largely because I wanted to know this information so that I could maneuver and be more effective in this space. Some people would argue that this is not the case, and would take it up positions against me, and that's fine. Politics is not known for not alienating people or antagonizing them, but we'll get into that later, naming names, and if you will, failed projects and things like that. So the other thing that compelled me about this book, the writing this book and bringing this show into being, is that Silicon Valley is the modern city, and it's actually done, and I don't mean just it is a modern city, I mean it is the modern city, the embodiment of the modern city. There's other cities in the world that are far more developed and far more advanced, like areas of Japan and China and the Middle East, are spending billions of dollars to have the most technologically advanced place and city in the world. That's not what this is. What we are the zeitgeist of the contemporary moment. Every era in human history, there has been that city that affects the world or its immediate world. So, for a time, for example, Cairo was that city. At different stages of its life, it was under the pharaohs, under the Romans, under the Greeks, you name it. At different periods, it defined everything that was going on. Just like Sumer was that city, Babylon was that city, Rome was that city, Paris was that city, London was that city, New York was that city, Chicago was that city, and San Francisco was that city. They all had their moments, and they're not unique to the Western Hemisphere or just the Americas or the Mediterranean. They always have them. They shine bright for a period of time and then they fade. In some cases, they live off of a legacy and then structural things about how society and civilization built up around it. So, for example, in Rome, Rome is Rome. It has its classic ruins, but it also is the home of the Vatican, which means it's never not going to be that, right? You can't. Rome isn't Rome without the Vatican. The Vatican isn't the Vatican without Rome. Jerusalem is another one of those cities that arguably that can be said. And so what happens is it has a more stagnant life, like it's not a vibrant life as in today, and it becomes a follower, not a leader. That is where we are, Silicon Valley, this area, not a city, this geographic space that has been at the center of modern innovation. It's contemporary in this moment right now. Tomorrow there's going to probably be some tech announcement that's going to be groundbreaking, and it's where people want to come and it's where people want to work. And it's just is that place. What's intriguing though is it reinvented itself. It actually, in the period of the 90s, it was very plausible that Silicon Valley could have died. The industries were down, industries were leaving, and it needed a jolt of reinvention, and it succeeded in doing that for a variety of reasons. We'll get to that in another show. But this thing is something I've always wanted to, not want to study. I just realized that that's where we are. Circumstantially speaking, we are in that place where the world is popping. Shit is happening here. It's not just our shit. It is globally effective shit, because there is tons of reports, and I'm talking government reports and plans and projections and projects and analyses all over the world, where what they say is what we're trying to build is the next Silicon Valley. And there's only one of us. There's only one Silicon Valley. There's been a lot of pretenders, but almost all of them are extension of us in one way, shape, or form. They're like a tendril to the octopus. An analogy that will come back more and more as time goes on. But we are the center point. It all began here. And there's a reason that these companies are staying here. The industrial base is left of technology, but the innovative, the mind power, the creative power, the IP of both types, intellectual property and the initial public offering, are at the forefront of what's happening. And in some cases, the population is affected by it, but doesn't understand it. And that was one of the things I wanted to get at. And I wanted to get beyond the computer, get beyond tech, get beyond this notion that everything lives off of a motherboard or a silicon wafer. For one, we don't even make silicon wafers here anymore, really. Even the big disk drive companies are still here, but manufacturing primarily takes place abroad, namely in China or South Asia. But there's another history here, and the other history is manyfold and goes back many, many years to the birth of the United States as a country, as well as the trials and tribulations of Mexico, but is also the tragic tale of the unimaginable genocide that Native people faced on this continent, and particularly this area, and how they're fragmented and how they're also still here. These people still exist, and these phases of that history still exist and cultivate the soil that is modern Silicon Valley. Silicon Valley, ironically, being this place that the richest soil in the world, and I mean that, the actual earth itself, the dirt on which you grow things, lies 6 feet under asphalt under our feet here. You know, there's been a few breadbasket places that were well known throughout history as being very, very abundant in what they were able to produce in terms of agriculture. That was Egypt on the Nile. Almost every case, the main thing that you would see is intersections of rivers or white fresh water and marshland, because that has a tendency to really, really, really charge up the soil with minerals and allow for it. And so that was what we were. And today, the old Silicon Valley Bowl, which was referred to as the Valley of Heart's Delight during its agricultural era, really only exists in memory to some degree, and that's fading. And then it exists in the southern end of the valley, Gilroy, Morgan Hill, and but the city space, the suburban city space, and that's a whole other item. This is a modern city that isn't a modern city in the sense of the city that builds up, even though now the so-called capital of Silicon Valley, San Jose, has been building upward. But it isn't that type of city. This is a city that is a sprawl. It is one massive circuit of smaller cities, ancillary cities, and veins that go out into this large area of suburbia. And it is the birthplace of this innovative moment. And why is that? Why are they here? What's gone before? What's going on now? When it comes to radicalism, there's always been an element of social upheaval. In the tech sphere, they call this disruption. But there's disruption, and then there's disruption, and then there's also the kind of disruption that is harmful in terms of it has unintended consequences. In war, it's the collateral damage. And there is collateral damage as modernity itself comes into being. And that's what we're seeing here. I didn't really have an initial topic to start. Like I said, I was trying to figure out this place. How would I describe it in a phrase or paragraph? And what really affected me was an article and later a book by a renowned Marxist sociologist by the name of Mike Davis out of UCLA. Mike Davis wrote a book that is quite famous about LA, and the same, and my own book is kind of modeled after it, is called City of Quartz. But he also wrote an essay in a book later on, many years later, about over probably 10 years ago at least, called Planet of Slums. He goes into specifics of slum areas. These are where class divide is so immense and squalor is paramount. And he focuses on these mega cities. And that's the secondary part of the thesis, is the role of the mega city. So where you go beyond the cosmopolitan into the metropolitan. And that these cities are now metropolitan. Cairo being one, Mexico City being another. Dhaka, Bangladesh is another. There are these cities that encompass everything around it. And then I realized in reading this book, though we're not a slum per se, that is the Bay Area, and particularly Silicon Valley as an extension. It is a mega city, a megapolis. And that's the metropolitan city, a city of many cities. And once I started looking at things that way, the Bay Area activism, history, and politics started taking on a new hue. I was able to look at it in a way that enabled me to have a concrete point of beginning and end in terms of my activities in the world, be it finding work, to my political opinions and or analyses on any given subject or event or time. And I could see that though it didn't have the hostility, the overt hostility and conflict and dire view, we were, in a manner, the same, cut from the same cloth as a Cairo, as a Dhaka, as a Bangladesh, as a many populated space. There's a handful of those in the United States in general. St. Louis used to be one. These are major population hubs. Chicago, New York, San Diego, and Los Angeles. So a similar phenomenon as what happened here has happened in Los Angeles. You can now drive out of Los Angeles to San Diego and never leave a suburban space now. You wouldn't know. One street looks just like the next. So this book influenced me to look at things in a radically different manner. I just couldn't understand why certain things were working the way they were. And this offered me a granular seed, if you will, to look into things and deeper than I had been and start categorizing things into my files. And yes, I actually have files. I catalog things. And so from there, I've been trying to figure my way through and figure things out. And I just have a different perspective than most people. And so a lot of the show is going to be based on that kind of thinking, not just this particular episode, but the show in general. Episode to episode likely will be topically one and the same thing as the chapters that I would be doing in my book. But they're accessible now. You could hear it now. And hopefully at some point in the future, it'll be Q&A. And, we can have conversations, discussions about these items and factoids and the ramifications. And of course, I'm open to you guys smashing my analyses. At the present moment, let's define the importance of Silicon Valley in ways that aren't strictly about innovative technology. Silicon Valley and San Jose was so important recently. It's been made important multiple times in different ways. One of the first ways it became extremely important recently and reframed was actually by the financial sector. And it first really started, it always been looked at as a, not a novelty, but a hot property, if you will. That tech was something to invest in, but that is not what the traditional financial sector makes money off of. It makes money off of industry, off of trading, which is the actual buying and selling of stocks and bonds or related financial packages in and around investments. And it makes it off of finance itself, money itself, banking. That's big banks, right? That is one of the core groups that have been able to run this country for a long time. And I'm talking about that they are the social, political, and governmental elite. They are the rich, and the rich get richer, and the poor get poorer, and everything in between. But they also are broken up into sectors. And the sectors are the industrial sector. There's oil men, which aren't necessarily industry. Industry is like logging, steel, auto workers, those sorts of things. Industrial products, and also the commodities that allow for the building of those products. There's agricultural sector. There's the financial sector, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We are the tech sector. But we were not always the tech sector. So in 2011, a major financial magazine, in the midst of Occupy Wall Street, said something equivalent to, if we have instead of an Occupy Wall Street, why don't we have an Occupy Silicon Valley? And this isn't the same as the politics on the ground. This, people from the community that get together and kind of build their own Occupy. And you know what Occupy is? That was basically a public political tactic, a movement, if you will, to take over public space and use it for the purposes of grievances. And it was also a space in which not just political dialogue, education, and networking took place, but where the rudimentary beginnings of a genuine class consciousness in the United States started to emerge. And what I mean is by class consciousness is a distinction between one group and another group based on a variety of elements, but primarily wealth and ownership and access to means of production, who owns means of production and or the resources to that. And so their reduced form of this was the simple analysis of the 1%. The 99% were never actually labeled. It was just us versus the 1%. That's very us versus them, but it was not inaccurate again. So then what was it that the financial sector was asking for? Why would they bring up big tech? And the reason was because following 2008 and the financial crisis, you had a weakening in confidence in a specific part of the American, not just domestic, but global economy. The tech sector, however, weathered it just fine. It may have had an effect on the individual level, like an individual tech worker that overspent, got a bad loan, etc. But as far as industry and industry unto itself and corporations unto themselves, they continued to flourish and blossom and grow. They didn't shrink, and they became more and more powerful in how they represented themselves and were able to move politics in the world. And sorry about that, my phone notifications. And so in a manner of speaking, what it was is the financial sector was doing three things at the same time. One, it was recognizing that there's a competitor. There's something other than us out there that is a mover and a shaker, and that is big tech itself. The second was, of course, a distraction. We're not the problem, they're the problem. Go look at them. Why don't you look at them? That sort of thing. And the third factor was the claim belied an underlying anxiety from the financial sector that there is a new player at the table, and this player is dangerous, and it should be checked. But also, it was a silent declaration of how much power was available in the tech sector and or Silicon Valley as its representative center of power, if you will. And that was really misunderstood. Instead, it was understood as cities. It was parochial, like small thinking. We didn't really look at things in a larger way. And not to negate the organic birth or an underpinning of crisis that took place in San Francisco and Oakland. Oakland by far becoming, next to Wall Street itself, the most, the other side of the axis of Occupy as a movement. And Silicon Valley was in the shadow of that. And why was that? Why was it, that it didn't have that vibrancy? Why didn't an Occupy Silicon Valley in more than just a brief, a name with a very brief lifespan? Why didn't that come into being? There's a myriad of reasons why that is, but the point being that in that moment in history, Silicon Valley became extremely important. It was acknowledged outside of the back room, outside of the industry of tech itself. It was seen by movers and shakers in, East Coast power centers as something to be reckoned with. Within a matter of years, what you also had emerging were the richest companies in the world, corporations. Apple being the first, and it was liquid, meaning Apple had cash reserves and numbered in the, I believe it was $6 to $8 billion, which is more than the majority of countries in the world combined don't have that much money. But this corporation was here, and I just so happen to live not that far. I live within walking distance. Apple Computer, and now, and even its current space donut that it's building. And this is another indicative moment. This is saying it isn't just about the politics of this industry, but they're so successful that they've knocked out what we thought was rich, what we thought was powerful, what we thought was influential. And these corporations and their leadership became recognized elite, nouveau riche, the new rich, if you will. But they were of such a degree and capacity that they were almost unprecedented, and they were young for the most part. And they had different politics. Their politics, to some degree, are sympathetically progressive, but they also have other types of politics. And these politics were being misunderstood, both by the people in the area and also people outside of the area. There's instead, like in the activist scene, for example, there is something that I was growing completely annoyed with, which is the flight moment. It's like birds, stepping out of their nests and needing to fly. And what you have is activism in Silicon Valley being either a stagnant institutional thing, and unfortunately today it is a byproduct of the nonprofit industrial complex, and it outputs managers, activist managers that have the theatrics and the language of radicalism, but aren't actually radical. And I'll explain why that is. It's actually not a personal political stance. It's a structural political stance, because nonprofit organizations cannot be radical. Legally, they're not allowed to be. And I'll get into that at another time. The other element, though, is this wealth was not being put into action. And really, it didn't get put into action until the 1990s and the Clinton administration. And ironically, now he's a conservative, then he was quasi-liberal. A gentleman by the name of Wade Randlett realized, holy crap, there's billions of dollars here untapped. Why don't I have fundraisers here? Why don't I do things here? And he built the initial power base for essentially the Democratic Party, because the Republican Party just doesn't have the same sort of sway. They align on not issues, but points of interest, like for taxation, for example, we'll say. There might be an alliance there, but on progressive issues, broader issues of society and legislation, the right in this country, the conservatives, do not align with the values as present in Silicon Valley for the most part. And unfortunately, most of them are Randian, and Ayn Rand is who I'm referring to. They're libertarian, quasi-libertarian. And anything that isn't to say libertarians are Randians. They're not. They're actually totally different things. But there's a common thing between them, which is they're believers in free enterprise, but they don't believe in unions, for example. And so stay away from my money, but we are cool with being socially progressive. Rand herself and her idea is not socially progressive. It's very conservative, but it is also about the by the bootstraps mentality of individual success. It plays into the legend of Silicon Valley, of the startup, of the power CEO, the inventor, the big brain, bringing things into fruition. And Randlett was able to monopolize this in a way to where he made the Democratic Party beholden. beholden to the monies that were available in Silicon Valley, but it was also a gimme in the sense that people could come through, raise the money they needed, and bounce right out. But they'd be fat checks, and also political action committees, things like that. Anything to push forward a progressive agenda. In this case, it was neoliberalism or Clintonianism. And to their shock, when Clinton, both Bill and Hillary, came into town, they had an affiliation on the academic level through the institution of Stanford University, primarily, and Berkeley to a lesser degree, and Hillary's own history with feminism in terms of a network, and then, of course, the generic Democratic Party network. But what they didn't have is they didn't have any understanding of tech, and they had zero concept of exactly how much wealth was here. Wade Randlett literally had a meeting. It's brilliantly, all of this is brilliantly outlined in a book by from the late 90s, I believe, early 2000s, called Hacking the Party Line. Written by one of a then editor and writer of Wired Magazine. A writer for Wired Magazine, journalist. Wade Randlett held a private party, like a dinner party, fundraiser party. And it was a who's who of all the CEOs, the richest people in the Valley, including the venture capitalists, the money men that invest to make big tech into big tech. What they call the Sand Hill Posse, if you will. They're not actually called the Sand Hill Posse, but I call them Sand Hill Posse because they wrote Posse. Sand Hill Road is where a lot of these VCs are located in Palo Alto. I remember where it was. Palo Alto, for sure, Palo Alto. And what happened is he opened the eyes of Bill and Hillary, like to the point where they were like, "Holy shit, this is a lot of money. You could get this much like that on a fly," and that laid the foundation for what was to come. Now they, as was, if we remember the Obama election and presidency, what was it they said? There's the first president to ever use email. It shows you how antiquated and caught in the past Washington, D.C. was, and the New York set, versus how the vibrant and innovation and tech access and readiness and preparedness, literacy, if you will, with technology that existed here. So Wade was able to build not so much a political apparatus, though it was, because it was one he could leverage at different times and do different things. It could be shut down also just by like convincing them that all they need is money. But what he built was a machine for fundraising, absolutely. And little by little, Wade, as he does today, started working with not so much political action committees, but around special interests, and being a consultant or lobbyist type, if you will. But as the second wave of Silicon Valley people emerged out of the Great Recession of the late 90s, early 2000s, you had the rebooming of new tech. That was, the rise of Facebook, the rise of Google, for example, and not rebranded, but a revitalized Apple. And they led the way into this next phase, away from the previous phase of lead corporations in Silicon Valley. And these people were more interested in progressive values. They were of a generation built on diversity and multiculturalism as values, supposedly. And it isn't until then that we can actually openly see the flexing muscle of the political interests and influence of Silicon Valley. To a large extent, Barack Obama himself was the perfect Silicon Valley president in terms of his positions, his politics, things like that. He even used the technology, right? He had some of his major advisors were founders in Facebook, for example, and using data analytics, which is obviously in the news today with the Russian spying and what do you call it, voting scandal, them getting involved in the last presidential election. They use analytics, data science, if you will, in a way that it helps political aims, building agendas, things like that. There's a variety of recommended reading and viewing that I'll add in here at a different time. What we saw coming out of 2006, in particular, during the midst of the No on 4437 immigrant rights movement, was almost immediately thereafter how major political parties maneuvered to get their aims, and how this new form of big tech was being activated and intervening. And one of the best examples of this is big tech is very much on the side of immigration reform. Why? Because the majority of their intellectual workforce, these big innovators, these programmers, engineers, are coming from abroad. The US just doesn't produce enough of them at a fast enough rate to feed the industry. The industry can always use more of them. And this means that these are immigrants. They have to come with visas and things like that. So what happened is, particularly Mark Zuckerberg took his roommate and invested this money. And slowly but surely, the immigration debate and the lobbying, the navigation, if you will, for reform was taken out of the hands of the immigrant that we know, particularly in San Jose. At that time, the vision of one, which is, typically an undocumented alien Mexicano, more often than not, or Centro Mexicano, and underskilled labor and working kind of day to day. This is the image that they paint. That's not the image, of course, being used by these kind of neo sweatshops that are these corporations, and they're in their maze of desks, if you will, and desktops and laptops and everything in between. They were able to build their own formal political action committee, have funding, which the grassroots never has, and essentially derail by taking over the narrative of comprehensive immigration reform and more importantly, immigration in general. That is where Silicon Valley has become more and more involved in politics. It had always been there. It had always been part of it. In fact, this idea of analytics itself goes back a long way and has been something used by the military and the government for decades. It's called a network system analysis. Not network as in the form of computers, but network in terms of social networks. And I also don't mean Facebook or MySpace or Twitter or whomever. That's not what I'm referring to. I'm referring to your personal in-life social network, but also networks of power. Who teaches who? How does this person learn? Who supplies who? Blah, 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 blah. These kind of analytics and analytics-driven decision-making and institution building have become more and more and more predominant and prevalent in American culture since at least the 1950s, even though these ideas began much earlier, as early as the 1920s and 30s, the rise of the real industrial and then later computational era. And so now it's just publicly known. The face of big tech, these actual CEOs and things like that, always are trying to paint a picture where their focus is on innovation, not politics. And so they engage in politics as needed. For example, um, Facebook being in hot water over the role of this Russian bots and their use in campaigns, and also over privacy. Then you also had the Edward Snowden case, and the Edward Snowden reveal, of course, galvanized Silicon Valley and the world to see a different world and how things are being done, and the way things are moving. So then if that's the politics outside of this place as run from within this place, what is the politics on the ground here? How is the power relationships here, like from city to city? What is the local government doing? What is the local political culture in the hood, in the suburbs, in your apartment complex, in your condominium, in your Bayside home? What are they? What do they understand? What do they know about the history of this place? And what they're getting into. And that's really what it's about. Do you know what you're getting into? Because I've been here a while. Wasn't born here. I was born in Los Angeles, but I've been here since I was in my single digits of age, and lived in different areas. What is now Silicon Valley, not just the same place all the time. And as coincidence would have it, I was always intimately present as those places went through a transition into something other than they've been before. As time goes on with the show, we'll go through that. So, pardon my meandering and everything I'm saying. I'm probably going to wrap it up here for the moment. This is your loose introduction into what the show may be about, what my rambling may be about. And even though it's incomplete in terms of the topics, I will get back to them. This was my verbal sketch. That's really what you were along for the ride with me on, is my verbal sketch of how I might approach an introduction or preface to a book of this place. Hopefully it wouldn't be so rambling and kind of all over the place. It'd be more concise. And I have some attempts at it. I'll probably read that next time around. Some attempts that are concise. But in the meantime, it's just about discussion. So I haven't set up a time or anything of that sort at this stage, but I likely will set up a regular time for the show, so there can be some live elements of conversation, discussion, what have you. And hopefully taking it to its next level, or just a different incarnation, an incarnation you can recognize. I know I dropped a few little tidbits here and there, but we'll get back to it soon. I suppose what I'm going to do next is, not on this show, but the next show is I'm going to start to do news and analysis of big events that are taking place, and also that have local and or broader impacts, cultural impacts. And as well as doing some recommendations in terms of reading and viewing for people, what they would like to see. I'm going to put this out there. Let's see what you all think of it, and get back to me. Like I said, this is the preliminary. This is the prototype. This isn't the full-fledged version. But I thank you for listening, and hopefully I'm better at it next time.